Welcome to the new video where we will explore what is CIS Top 18 controls. I just wanted to create a video to explore what are the 18 controls and how organizations can leverage to maintain compliance with these controls. What kind of practices and tools can we use to make sure our compliance with the CIS controls, and just cover and explain what are these controls, how they came about, and just to create a more understanding of what organizations can leverage to make sure they are compliant with security controls and make sure they prevent breaches in the future. So CIS is a Center for Internet Security, which is a non-profit organization which was formed in October 2000. And essentially, it's an organization that is headquartered in East Greenwich in New York, with members including large corporations, government agencies, and academic institutions. The Center for Internet Security makes the connected world a safer place for people, businesses, and governments through our core competencies of collaboration and innovation. So it's a Center for Internet Security is an organization that established CIS Controls and CIS benchmarks, which are globally recognized best practices for securing IT systems and data. Also, another important thing to know is CIS is a home for Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, also known as MS-ISAC. It's a trusted resource for cyber threat prevention, protection, response, and recovery for US state for all the local government entities, and also the Electronics Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, also known as EI-ISAC, which supports the rapidly changing cybersecurity needs for the US election offices. So what are these top 18 controls? So this is the graph that covers all of the 18 controls. So as you can see in the picture, guys, all of these controls are broken down into implementation groups and also has a list of safeguards that are included in each control. So CIS Top 18 controls, we are currently in version 8, and it's formerly known as SANS Critical Security Controls, which formerly been known as SANS Top 20, and CIS Critical Security Controls. So CIS Controls now, as they are called today, is a set of 18 prioritized safeguards to mitigate the most prevalent cyber attacks against today's modern systems and networks. And as I mentioned, CIS controls are grouped into implementation groups, which allow organizations to use risk assessments in order to determine the appropriate level of implementation group, which is numbered 1 to 3, that should be implemented for their organization. So these CIS controls can be downloaded from the CIS website. And they also provision various mappings to frameworks such as NIST, CSF, NIST Special Publication 800-53, and others. They also provide a free hosted software product called CIS Controls Assessment Tool, which allows organizations to track and prioritize the implementation of these controls. So it's a great tool if you are on a journey to start implementing these controls. That's a perfect tool to start. The main reason CIS controls advocate for defense in depth model is to prevent and deter malware. There was a study completed in May 2017 which showed that on average organizations fail about 55% of compliance checks as established by Center for Internet Security. And these are the main reasons why we keep hearing organizations having breaches, having their data exposed, is because organizations sometimes still fail to complete the basics. And I count the top 18 controls as basics in your cybersecurity hygiene. And the key point in here is as well, they leverage defense in depth. So defense in depth means that we try and layer additional controls one with each other that allows to prevent specific breaches. So what does that mean? We layer like an onion, so we never have one specific control that only will stop, for example, malware. We have 2 or 3 different controls that will prevent malware in our organization. CIS also, which you might have heard, launched CIS Hardened images for things like Amazon Web Services, essentially in a response to a growing concern surrounding data safety and information housed on virtual servers. Also, they made available a CIS benchmark for hardened systems, including Windows, Linux, Ubuntu, and any additional images. So if you browse for Center for Internet Security website, you will find a lot of CIS benchmarks for if you are creating like a SQL box, if you're creating a Windows server, if you're building a specific Linux machine or Ubuntu machine. It has a predefined hardened images and how to harden these specific machines in production workloads. So it's a great resource to use that. Also, in April 2018, CIS launched an information security risk assessment method, which allows us to implement CIS controls. So this is called CIS-RAM, risk assessment method. So it's a great way to start implementing these controls. So let's explore the controls one by one and see how these controls can be leveraged, what kind of tools we can use to leverage the controls, and how we can secure our organizations based on CIS Top 18. So the first control is inventory of and control of enterprise assets. So the key point in here is in the first control is to establish and maintain a complete and up-to-date inventory of all assets that access your networks. So it should include all hardware assets connected to infrastructure, whether it's physically connected, virtually or remotely, or even if they're not under your control. So examples can include servers, non-computing and IoT devices, network devices. So the asset inventory should also document how critical each asset is to your organization's operations. Be sure to record your network addresses or IP addresses, machine names, enterprise asset owners, and hardware addresses. Also, you need to make sure that you include each asset's department and whether it has an approval to connect to your network. You have to make sure that you update the inventory whenever you introduce a new asset in your environment, because a well-maintained inventory will naturally help track your assets and manage costs, but it will also help you understand and prioritize security risks. So the key point in asset criticality and asset inventory, because you will highlight which assets are critical in your environment, which deems to hold critical data as well as manage critical workloads, because by that classification, risk will not be equal to risk. So if you have, for example, a server that runs your e-commerce website, a specific vulnerability on it will not be equal to the same as a vulnerability on receptionist's laptop. Obviously, the downtime of your e-commerce website that generates your highest revenue will be the bigger risk than any other machine. You have to make sure you address any unauthorized assets. So you have to review your inventory thoroughly and identify unauthorized assets such as employees' personal smartphones or laptops. So it's a key point to track those BYOD devices, bring your own devices or laptops, because unauthorized devices are not properly managed by your IT team, and they are often riddled with vulnerabilities that hackers can exploit to gain access to your network. So you have to set up a process to check for and address those unauthorized assets on a weekly basis. Options for dealing with unauthorized assets include, removing them from network, denying the ability to connect remotely to the network, and quarantining it. So the key points here, you have two ways of going about it. You can utilize an active discovery tool. So CIS recommends investing in an active discovery tool that can reveal all of the assets in your network and differentiate between authorized and unauthorized assets. So you can configure a tool to execute it, daily or more frequently, depending on your organization's risk appetite. Scan your network and discover those assets. You can also leverage things like Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, DHCP. So essentially, it's a protocol that assigns IP addresses to your devices. So as they are assigning IP addresses, you can log the traffic that's happening within DHCP service, and you can discover devices by this way. You can also use a passive asset discovery tool. So while active scanning check for new devices on your networks, passive asset tools can also help identify any devices that's sending traffic to your network. You can also use historical log data to find assets that breach your networks in the past. So these are the key critical component of how we leverage this control. So if we move into the control number 2, it's CIS control number 2, which is inventory and control of software assets. So similar to how hardware, we have to make sure we create and maintain a detailed record of all of the software and the computers in your network. For each software asset, include as much information as possible. So make sure you have things like title, publisher, installation date, supported systems, business purpose, related URLs, deployment method, version. Also, you might need to include things like the commissioning date. This information can be either used in some kind of tool, it can be created in a document or a database, to make sure that you keep your inventory up to date by reviewing and updating it whenever you introduce new software, or on a periodic basis, whether it's quarterly or biannually, or however you deem necessary based on your risk appetite. Also, another key point, you have to make sure that you use authorized software and that software is currently supported. So what I mean is, if you look at, for example, Windows operating systems. So currently I think most of the people are using Windows Server either 2019 or 2022. So for example, if someone is using Windows Server that's 2012 or 2008, these operating systems are no longer supported. So what does that mean? If there's vulnerability discovered, Windows are no longer sending patches to those specific operating systems. So we should not be using those operating systems in our estate. You also have to make sure you address unauthorized software. So employees sometimes, install software on business systems without approval from the IT department. So you have to make sure, you track that software and you remove this unauthorized software to reduce the risk to your business. If a piece of unauthorized software is needed, either they need to be added to the authorized list, or document an exception process. How do we deal with that specific software? You can utilize automated software inventory tools as well. How to create and maintain a software inventory. Automating it is a key process while discovering it. So, to reduce the burden. The one key point here as well, what we need to do is allow list of authorized software. So some of you who might be aware in cybersecurity and in security in generally, we always have two ways of dealing with lists. So we have a block list and allow list. The block list is normally much more cumbersome to leverage, because we need to determine all of the unauthorized software to be added into the block list. So it's much easier way to create an allow list, a list of approved and authorized software, and essentially block everything else that is outside of a allow list. So it's much easier way to manage this. The same way we do with firewalls and everything else. We just create rules that allow traffic, but we block the rest. So the same way we should leverage it for our authorized software. You can also create allow lists for authorized libraries, as well as a allow list for authorized scripts that we allow to run in our enterprise. So this is essentially, and some of the tools mentioned here, as you can see in the picture, we have ServiceNow software asset tool. Also, you can leverage something. Some of the tools nowadays have so much capabilities that you can leverage something like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. It also allows you to track and inventory all of the software assets on individual laptops. So it's a great tool as well to create an inventory list. Now, if we move into control number 3, control number 3 covers data protection. That is a big control. There's a lot of information and there's a lot of controls that cover data protection. So organizations should have a data management process that addresses data sensitivity, retention, storage, backup, and disposal. So your data management process should follow a well-documented enterprise level standard that aligns with regulations your organization is subject to. So we need to create, again, same as for hardware, same as for software, we need to establish and maintain data inventory, because how can you protect data if you're not aware of what data you have in your organization? So it's important to identify what data your organization produces, retains, and consumes, as well as how sensitive it is. So we always need to classify that data as well. This inventory should include both unstructured data like documents and photos, as well as structured data such as data stored in the databases. So we need to control and configure data access controls. So make sure that each user has access to only the data and applications and systems on your network that they need to do their job. That relates to least privilege control. In particular, be sure to implement access controls to protect your sensitive data from being exposed to people who shouldn't have access to it. That's very important. Another very important point is enforce data retention. What do I mean by that? So if you work in specific regulatory environments, for example, like financial services, you might be collecting personal identifiable information about your customers. So there are specific regulations that might say that you need to hold that data, say, for 7 years. So instead of creating data inventory and tracking that, because we get users potentially probably daily purchasing things, and we collecting data daily. So the more we can automate these tasks, so if we can create a rule set that says once we create a personal identifiable information in our databases, that data lives for 7 years and then it's automatically deleted. Data should only be collected based on business purpose and business use case. We should also create a privacy notice to our customers of how we are collecting the data, what purpose does that data serves, and how are we using that data. That's a key point, when we are collecting personally identifiable information or any other kind of sensitive information. You also make sure you have a way to securely dispose data. If anyone who's familiar with digital forensics, just deleting data off the hard drive, that does not mean that this data is lost. That data still can be recovered. And also, if we have a way of storing data in a paper format, we have to have an approved service that can shred our data and dispose of that data. So it's very important. Also, we need to make sure that we encrypt data on end user devices So encrypted data on end user devices, it's a, everyone knows it's a security best practice, and it helps protect data from being misused if the device is compromised or if the device is lost as well. We have to make sure and establish and maintain a data classification scheme. So classifying data using well-defined stringent criteria helps you distinguish sensitive and critical data from the rest. So most of you heard about, there is, most organizations leverage data classification, things, labels such as potentially can be public data, internal data, sensitive data, highly sensitive or secret. There's various ways that companies can leverage this classification, but you need to make sure you can distinguish sensitive data from public data. You also need to document your data flows. So make sure you map the movement of data through your organization, as well as in and out of the enterprise, which helps you identify potential vulnerabilities that could weaken your cybersecurity. You need to make sure you encrypt data on your removable media. You encrypt sensitive data in transfer, as well as you encrypt sensitive data at rest. So the 3 stages of data is data at rest, which is stored in database on your hard drive, data in transit, whereas when we are browsing, when the data is moving, and then also data in use while we actually actively interacting with data. So these are 3 stages of data that you normally will discover. You also need to make sure that you segment data processing and data storage based on the data sensitivity labels that we just discussed. And also what you can do is leverage a data loss prevention solution. There are solutions and tools nowadays who can detect anomalies in data traffic. They can also, prevent from data exfiltration. You can, for example, some organizations choose to use tools to prevent data from being moved into, USB devices, or you can, leverage tools that potentially tracks data that goes into any external repositories such as, Dropbox, Box, and all of these things. And also you need to make sure that you log sensitive data access. So make sure there is accountability for every action that's been made on sensitive data. Now, if we move in Control 4, Control 4 is all about secure configuration of enterprise assets and softwares. So, just deploying an asset doesn't mean that you're going to be leverage security, or just because you have an inventory of assets. You need to make sure that you leverage configuration standards in the development and application of a strong initial configuration. So following by continuous management of your enterprise assets and tools, and these assets can be anything, from laptops, workstations, firewalls, routers, switches, servers, IoT devices, operating systems. All of these have to have a secure configuration in order to protect your organization. So you can develop, your configuration standards based on best practice guidelines. You can also leverage things like, as we mentioned earlier, CIS benchmarks. So once you have an established secure configuration process, be sure to review it and update it every year, because things happen. Changes are constant in enterprises, so you need to make sure you are aware of any changes. So keys to success is, adopt an IT framework, find a trusted security framework that can act as a roadmap for implementing appropriate controls. Get to know your applications, start by getting a baseline of all your systems, record changes as you make them, frequently monitor and review activity, and be sure to document everything. Implement vulnerability and configuration scanning. That's a very important. Discover any particular vulnerabilities or deviations from your configuration. You also you can choose a system that can differentiate between good and bad changes. So change management is a key in this process as well. Establish and maintain a secure configuration process for network infrastructure. So, because network devices provide connectivity and communication and control the flow of information in an organization, they are usually the top targets for malicious actors. So it's vital to discover vulnerabilities and use secure configuration process in your network infrastructure. You also need to configure automatic session locking on enterprise assets. So to mitigate the risk of malicious actors gaining unauthorized access to your workstations, servers, and mobile devices, if the authorized user steps away without securing them, you should implement automatic session locking. So it's essentially a similar way to what does automatic lock screen does. So as soon as someone walks away, we always preach controls such as controls on people, saying that if you walk away from your device, make sure you lock it. But as we all know, due to pressures at work, due to something, everyone's a human, they can forget. But if we can enforce this automatically without relying on a person, that control is going to be much more likely successful than just regarding on a person to always remember to lock their screen. And also implement and manage a firewall on servers. Firewall is a key, control for protection of sensitive data. So, it will, protect your servers from potential unauthorized users. It will also block certain types of traffic and run programs only from trusted platforms and other sources, Also, implement and manage a firewall on end user devices, not only on workstations. And lastly, manage default accounts on enterprise assets and software. So most of you are aware, whenever we are purchasing specific software, specific OS, most of these enterprise assets and software typically come pre-configured with default accounts such as root or administrator accounts, which are easy targets for attackers and can give them extensive rights in the environment. Sometimes, you deploy specific printers, they come predefined default accounts, and all of these accounts either need to be removed or their username and password needs to be changed to make sure we secure our environment. Also, need to make sure you uninstall or disable unnecessary services on enterprise assets and software. You need to also make sure you can configure trusted DNS servers on enterprise access, so domain name services. So your assets should use a enterprise controlled DNS servers or reputable externally accessed DNS servers, because malware is often distributed via DNS servers. So ensure that you promptly apply the latest security updates to help prevent infections. If hackers compromise a DNS server, they could use to host some malicious code. You can also enforce things like automatic device lockout on portable end user devices. We can also leverage in our mobile device management things like enforce remote wipe capability. So if device is lost or stolen, we can remotely wipe enterprise data from it. You need to also make sure you separate enterprise workspaces on mobile and end user devices. So you should create a separate enterprise workspace on users' mobile devices, specifically with regard to contacts, network settings, emails, and webcams. This will help prevent attackers who gain access to a user's personal applications from accessing your corporate files or proprietary data. CIS control number 5. So account management. So control number 5 focuses on establishing and maintaining an inventory of the administrator and user accounts in an enterprise. The account holder's name, start, stop dates, username, and department should be documented. It also can be beneficial for the purpose of the account. So maintaining an inventory requires regularly verifying that all accounts currently being used are authorized. You need to also make sure that you can utilize tools such as Active Directory. You maintain inventory of authorized software. You perform authenticated vulnerability scanning, establish secure configurations. You can also deploy SIEM or log analytic tool, and also make sure that you encrypt or hash all of the authentication or authenticated credentials. So the key point in here, make sure you use unique passwords. So we're not reusing accounts or passwords. So unique password for every single account. So don't reuse the passwords for many accounts, as this can be very easily breached. Create a minimum password length in your policies. So I'll showcase in the next slide, but there is various advice from organizations like NCSC that offer still a legacy advice on password lengths of minimum of 8 characters, which are no longer relevant anymore. So we should use nowadays a password length at least of anywhere between 12 to 14 characters. Avoid using passwords that are easy for hackers to guess, like names, dates of birth. Avoid reusing past passwords as well, because they might have been leaked. So you can go to organizations and websites like Have I Been Pawned and enter your email address, and normally there's information of where your email has appeared in the previous breaches. Make sure you change the default passwords for all applications. Make sure also disable any dormant accounts. So you should have a service, or you should have a review of your account. So it's up to you how you do that and what's your dormant amount of days is, but you make sure you disable accounts that have not been active for after 30, 45 or 60 days, whatever your period and risk appetite allows you in your organization. Make sure these accounts are removed. Also restrict the use of privileged accounts. So privileged accounts should be used only when needed to complete administrative tasks. So the process is called privileged identity management. So those of you who are aware or who are working currently in the cloud, there are processes, and I'm sure there's similar processes can happen in Active Directory. So when you have administrators, you only assign them user permissions, but you allow them to elevate to administrative permissions only for the certain amount of time while they are completing that specific task, because exposure of administrative account can lead to all sorts of trouble. So limiting that exposure as much as possible, it's a great way to leverage privileged account management tools. Also privileged identity management tools. So mostly they are called PIM. Obviously also establish and maintain an inventory of all of your service accounts, and make sure also you have a centralized account management. So the problem sometimes we have, if we have too many different systems, it's hard to track all of your accounts. So if we can centralize that in one unique place where we can track and get hold of all the service, all the roles and all the permissions for our accounts, that makes our life so much easier. So as I mentioned, guys, the key point about password length was, so as you can see, this table was created by a specific user, but currently there are tools that can crack passwords. I'm sure you are aware that there's hackers who can hack your passwords, but at the current rate, you can go on AWS, and as you can see, there is a virtual machine P3.16x large, so which nets you a cracking power of 632 gigahashes per second. So assuming we are cracking NTLM hashes, so NTLM is a common Windows hash. That means that these guys are capable of trying a whopping 632 billion different password combinations per 1 second. So as you can see, depending how you create your passwords or your password policy, so as you can see, if you just create a numerical password up to even 11 characters, it can be cracked instantly, whereas 12 characters is 2 seconds. So some of the organizations have a password policy that says minimum of eight characters, and it says any of the 3 out of the 4. So it says it has to have a number, it has to have a lowercase, an uppercase, and a special character. But it says only has to have, out of these 4, a minimum of 3. So if you use a number, upper and lowercase, or for example, you use a number and upper and lowercase, which is in the 3rd column. So 8-character password of number, upper and lowercase can be cracked in 6 minutes. So these passwords are no longer safe to be used. So we need to move somewhere in the region of minimum of 12 characters, as you can see them, plus including special characters. So then it will take 8 million years to crack. Therefore, we move towards safety. But as we discussed, it's all about layering that security. So that's just one of the controls. We're never going to be 100% secure just with increasing password length, but that's one of the layers in defense in depth. So as we move to the control number 6, so access control management. So establish an access granting process. You need to make sure you have a process of how you grant someone access. So have a defined process for granting access rights to users when they join the organization or when their roles change, which helps enforce and maintain least privilege. So that's the key. Also, establish an access revoking process. So when someone leaves the organization or when they change role or move departments, how we remove permissions. Because those organizations where they fail normally is people sometimes who end up working in an organization for a number of years, they might have 2-3 different roles, and as they move departments, instead of losing the old permissions, they just add the new permissions and more permissions, and that's called privilege creep. They have more permissions than they need to complete their task. Also, another layer in that defense in depth, making sure we require MFA for any externally exposed applications, and MFA for any remote network access, MFA for your admin accounts. But I would just say not just for admin, use MFA for every single account. You also need to make sure you establish and maintain an inventory of authentication and authorization systems. Again, same applies. Centralized access management and access control. So centralized access control, enables users to access different application systems, websites, and tools using the same credentials. So you can use things like single sign-on is an example way of using centralized access control. Define and maintain role-based access control. So trying to assign each user the right access individually through direct permissions assignment and keep those rights up to date over the time. It simply normally is not a scalable approach to access control. So instead, we use a role-based access control. So we are assigning access privileges to define roles in the organization. So we create specific roles that aligns with our organization and making them, each user a member of the appropriate roles in our organization. And that's how we, maintain least privilege and making sure that people have only privileges to make sure that they have enough privilege to complete their task, but not more. CIS Control 7, continuous vulnerability management. So establish and maintain vulnerability management process. So the key point is in this protection is to identification. So how organizations need to identify all their proprietary code, third-party applications, sensitive data, open source components, and digital assets. And then we need to evaluate. So all vulnerabilities discovered should be evaluated and prioritized. You can use common metrics such as Common Vulnerability Severity Score, CVSS, ease of exploitation by a threat actor, difficulty of resolution, financial impact of exploitation, and related regulatory requirements or industry standards. Obviously there are problems with CVSS, and normally we have to enrich that information of how that particular vulnerability is assessed in our environment, whether we have compensating controls, whether that vulnerability is on external facing machine, and what's the remediation process. So organization needs to patch or otherwise address the weaknesses according to their priority. So remediation is often managed through a combination of automatic updates from vendors as well as patch management. So as the more we can automate, the better we're going to be. But obviously some of the workloads, especially production workloads, updates sometimes create problems, and therefore normally organizations will establish a sort of a patch testing procedure. So for example, if pick something like Windows OS patches. When Windows deploy those patches, normally organizations wouldn't straight away and automatically patch their servers that runs their e-commerce site. What we would normally do, organizations can leverage a segregated environment, so where we can deploy a patch to a subset of machines that might not hold the production workloads, might be just internal servers or things like that, to allow testing. So say a week or 2 week testing, making sure that it allows our production workloads to work uninterrupted. Once we test that patch, then we can deploy that in production workloads. It's also important to document all vulnerabilities that are identified, the results of our evaluation process, and progress forward towards remediation. We have to establish and maintain how we do remediation. As I say, you have to have a process, you have to have a procedure. How do we do our remediation? Do we have a specific SLAs of how we're gonna patch which vulnerability based on its risk? As I mentioned, automatic patch management is very important. You can also perform automated vulnerability scan. So normally it's a key point to establish in your organization when you're going to scan what. So obviously sometimes you can segment specific subnets to scan at specific times. But for example, normally if you deploy a vulnerability management tool in your production workloads, sometimes these scanning tools can create a CPU spikes, RAM spikes. So you have to make sure that you create a window when vulnerability management scanning can happen. So normally these if your say peak working hours are, say your peak customer traffic is say between in the evenings or during daytime, you can scan overnight at midnight or whatever. You can create an automatic patching which subnet's going to be scanned when, or which specific machine is going to be scanned when, to make sure you're not disrupting workloads that might be busy during daytime. You can do network-based scans, host-based scans, application scans also. So there is various ways how we discover vulnerabilities. You can also do a differentiating check. So you can obviously do internal scan versus externally exposed assets scan. So organizations should pay a particular attention to finding vulnerabilities in sensitive data and other assets that are exposed to external users or your customers. Scanning for vulnerabilities externally exposed assets, at least monthly, as opposed to like quarterly, or some organizations does a yearly scan. It's too big of a gap to identify those particular vulnerabilities. And make sure you have a remediation process and remediation of those exposed vulnerabilities that has been discovered via your scans. So CIS Control 8, Audit Log Management. So the role of log management involves collecting, reviewing and retaining all of the logs as well as alerting about suspicious activity in the network or a system. So proper log management helps organizations to detect early signs of a breach or attack that appear in your system logs. It also helps to investigate and recover from security incidents. Audit logs provide a forensic level detail tray, including a stepwise record of the attacker's origin, identity, and methodology. Audit logs also are critical for incident forensics, telling you when and how the attack occurred. So we'll keep breaking down the audit log management to guide you in the compliant efforts. Is you have to establish and maintain log management process. So establish and maintain, the process that defines the enterprise logging requirements, and at the minimum to address the collection, review, and retention of audit logs. You have to make sure that your logs are also immutable. They can't be changed, because the key point is, if threat actor exploits your system, they normally will try and cover their tracks. So make sure that you have log immutability and they can't be changed. You need to make sure that you address, access to the logs. You have to limit the access to make sure that only relevant people have access to the logs, so such as your IT administrators or might be security personnel that have access to specific logs. You also have to categorize and resources from most to least auditable. So which ones needs the most logs, which one needs the least. Look for auditing solution that will cover most assets in least time. So normally, you can have, especially once we move it in cloud, you can gather most of the logs in your security incident and event management platforms, or have a specific log repository where you store all of your prized audit logs. You have to make sure also that you have adequate audit log storage. So you need to make sure you plan. So depending how long your log retention is going to be, you need to make sure you have appropriate storage to keep all of those logs. Make sure that you have correct information in the log, such as user IDs and credentials to cover accountability, terminal identities, any changes to the system configuration, date and time. It's probably not as relevant as it used to be now, but make sure time synchronization is there. Make sure that logs cover specific times and it's synchronized between the systems, because if the time is off by a couple of minutes, you might not find and correlate what's happening in the logs between the system. So that's very important. Collect detailed logs. Make sure provide enough detail, because most of the logging systems allow you to go up and down the detailed hierarchy of logs. So making sure that you create, for example, from operating system events, you have a system startup, shutdown logs, service startup and shutdown, network connection changes or failures, successful and failed attempts to change system security settings and controls. From operating system, you can collect things like timestamp, event status, and error codes and things like that. So all of these are very important. Also, make sure you collect your DNS query audit logs. It's very important for any dynamic updates, zone transfers, rate limiting, DNS signing. Also, collect all of the URL request audit logs. A URL request can expose information through the query string and pass sensitive data to the parameters in the URL, so attackers can obtain usernames, passwords, tokens, and any other sensitive information. So URL request audit logs is very important. Also, make sure you collect your command line audit logs as well. So things like PowerShell, Bash logs, because threat actors can use an insecure data transmission such as cookies and forms to inject command into the system, shell of a web server. So all of these logs are very important. Also make sure you centralize your audit logs, so keeping them in one location is very important. So hackers often use the tactic of deleting local log files to eliminate the evidence of the activity. So a centralized secure database of log data defeats this tactic and allows comparison of logs across multiple systems. Also make sure you retain your audit logs. So there's different regulatory requirements. So if you, for example, working with PCI DSS, there will be a requirement to keep all of the logs for 1 year. So again, depending on your risk appetite, depending on how long do you think logs are relevant in your organization, make sure you keep the logs for a minimum of 90 days, but if need be, you can keep them for longer. Also make sure that part of control, you conduct audit log reviews. So you review logs to make sure you can detect abnormal events that could signal a threat potentially. Use them to match endpoints with inventory and configure new endpoints if needed. Also collect all of the service provider logs. So that's how we address log management. And lastly, CIS control number 9, email and web browser protection. So how do we comply with this control? So to reduce the risk of security incidents, ensure that only fully supported browsers and email clients are used throughout the organization. So as we mentioned before, the same as with OS services, make sure browsers and email clients are only used the ones that are supported in organization and still provides patching. But both browsers and email client software should promptly be updated to the latest version. So make sure we have automatic patching, because older versions normally have gaps or vulnerabilities and they have a much higher chance of breaches. Also, make sure you use DNS filtering. So, domain name system enables web users to specify a friendly domain name. So as I explained in my previous video series, DNS name is essentially, if we type in www.google.com, normally the way computers work, DNS names essentially provides an IP address of that particular server that hosts that domain. So this is very important. Also maintain and enforce network-based URL filters. So to supplement the DNS filtering, we can also use network-based URL filters to further prevent enterprise assets from connecting to malicious or otherwise unwanted websites. Be sure to implement filters on all enterprise access for maximum protection. We can also restrict unnecessary or unauthorized browser and email client extensions again. So as I say, creating a whitelist, it's the way to go. Creating only allowed specific list of whether it's extensions, whether it's software, whether it's hardware. We always work with best practice allow lists. We can also implement a DMARC. So DMARC is domain-based message authentication, reporting, and conformance. Essentially, what it is, it helps email senders and receivers determine whether an email message actually originated from the purported sender and can provide instructions for handling fraudulent emails. DMARC protects organizations by ensuring that email is properly authenticated using domain keys. So there is a domain keys identified mail, which is also known DKIM, and also as well as sender policy framework SPF standards. So in particular, it helps prevent spoofing and from the other address if the email has to protect users from receiving malicious emails. It's very important. Also, you can block unnecessary file types. So in your email tools, normally nowadays, you can block file types that prevents from sending attachments. There is specific malicious file types, or even file types that allow execution. So you can have file types like exe, XML, .js, .docm, or .xps. All of these file types can be blocked in your email tooling. You also need to deploy and maintain email server anti-malware protection. So whether you have on-premise email server, or whether you have a specific online server solution, you should deploy and maintain anti-malware protection for those emails. So that's pretty much it, guys, for the first 9 controls. It's a lengthy video. That's why I thought I would split up into 2 video series. So we cover the first 9 controls in first video part, and then we'll cover the rest in a second part. Please like and subscribe if you find my videos useful, guys, and reach out to me if you wanted any other recommendations for any upcoming videos. But that's it for the part 1. I'll see you in part 2.